They came in the night, silent, invisible, and unstoppable. To the terrified German soldiers below, they were witches, riding on broomsticks made of wood and canvas, dropping death from the dark sky. But these were not witches. They were young women, Soviet pilots, barely 20 years old, and they became the most feared bomber unit of World War II. When the sky called their names in 1941, as Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Red Army began to collapse under the Blitzkrieg. Cities burned, millions fled, and every man was called to the front. But while men fought and died, thousands of women wanted to fight too, not as nurses or radio operators, but as combat pilots. Among them was a young woman named Marina Reskova, a record-breaking Soviet aviator, the Russian Amelia Earhart. She had already flown across Siberia, survived crash landings, and become a national hero. When the war began, she went straight to Moscow's command office and demanded one thing: give women the right to fly for their country. At first, the generals laughed, but Stalin didn't. He approved the creation of 3 all-female aviation regiments. One of them, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, would become legend. The Witches' Machines. They were given the worst planes in the Soviet arsenal. Tiny biplanes made of wood and fabric, originally designed for crop dusting. They were slow. They had no armor, and they could barely carry bombs. But these women, they turned them into weapons of terror. At night, the 588th would fly in silence, cut their engines just before reaching the target, and glide through the darkness. The Germans on the ground would hear nothing until the whisper of wind and the hiss of falling bombs, that eerie sound. It reminded them of witches riding broomsticks. They began to call them Nachthexen, the night witches. Witches in training. Most of the recruits were teenagers, students, clerks, farmers' daughters. They had never even driven a car. Now they were learning to fly at night, in snow, without lights, using only stars and instinct. Their training was brutal. They were mocked by male pilots, told they'd crash or worse, get lost in the dark. But by 1942, the 588th was ready. Commanded by Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, they were sent to the southern front, where the Nazis were pushing toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. Their mission: harass the enemy every night, destroy supply lines, ammo depots, and fuel stations. They flew up to 8 missions per night, sleeping in freezing trenches between sorties. They didn't have parachutes for months, and their uniforms were hand-me-downs from male pilots twice their size. Yet every mission, they returned, covered in frost, eyes burning, and ready to fly again. The Night Firestorm, June 8, 1942. The Night Witches launched their first large-scale attack. 40 planes took off under a moonless sky. The target, a German ammunition depot near the Don River. They flew low, only 500 feet above ground, engines off, gliding in silence. Then, a faint whistle in the dark. Then another, and within seconds, boom! The night exploded in orange flame. The Germans panicked, firing blindly into the sky. Tracer rounds tore through the darkness, but the witches were already gone, their little biplanes disappearing into black clouds. By dawn, the depot was gone, and the legend of the Night Witches had begun. The Germans' worst nightmare. By the end of that summer, the Night Witches were striking almost every night. They hit train lines, command posts, supply trucks, and they never used flares or radar. They flew by memory, by moonlight, and by courage. The Germans grew so afraid. They began to change their tactics, keeping lights on all night, hoping to spot the witches before they struck, but it never worked. Every time the soldiers saw faint silhouettes overhead, they would yell, "Nachthexen! The witches are here!" They even promised an iron cross to any soldier who could shoot one down. Few ever did. Legacy of the Sky Sisters. The 588th Regiment, later renamed the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment, flew over 30,000 combat missions. They dropped 23,000 tons of bombs, and they became the most decorated female unit in Soviet history. 30 of them earned the title Hero of the Soviet Union, but over 100 never returned. Their wooden planes were too fragile, their missions too dangerous, but their legacy unbreakable. They were not witches. They were daughters, sisters, students who turned fear into fire. And in the blackest nights of the war, they became the light that never went out. They came in the night and left only silence behind. The world remembers the soldiers, but the sky remembers the witches. By 1943, the witches ruled the night. Every evening, as darkness fell over the Eastern Front, German soldiers looked to the skies in fear. The sound of wooden wings meant only one thing: the night witches were coming. But the war was changing, and so were they. Fire over the Kuban. In early 1943, the Soviet counteroffensive began. The Red Army was pushing west, and the night witches were reassigned to the Kuban River front, one of the deadliest battle zones of the entire war. The nights were humid, filled with smoke and tracer fire. German flak guns lit up the skies like fireworks. Each mission felt like suicide. Their little planes, built from plywood and canvas, were slower than the enemy's bullets. One hit could turn them into burning torches, but still, they flew. 3 women per crew, a pilot, a navigator, and the night itself. They took off in pairs, gliding low through valleys, cutting their engines before every strike. Their bombs screamed down on German fuel depots and camps. Then they turned, disappearing into blackness, only to return minutes later for another run. The Germans began calling them the Daughters of the Devil, Sisters of the Sky. Inside their freezing, open cockpits, the women talked to each other over roaring wind. They couldn't use radios. It would give away their positions. So they developed their own language: hand signals, flashes of wings, even short light blinks between planes. They flew close, sometimes so close their wingtips nearly touched. They trusted each other with their lives. Among them were legends: Nadezhda Popova, who flew 852 combat missions. Her plane was hit multiple times, and once she returned with 42 bullet holes, still smiling. Yevdokia Bershanskaya, their commander, calm, strict, and fearless. She kept them disciplined even when supplies ran out and their airfield was bombed every morning. And Irina Sabrova, who flew over 1,000 sorties, a record no man in her unit ever achieved. They were more than pilots. They were sisters, bound by the night. The hunt. By mid-1943, the Germans began to fight back hard. They set up traps, searchlights, radar nets, and special night fighters waiting in ambush. The women had no radar, no armor, and no parachutes. If they were hit, there was no escape. But they adapted. They learned to fly even lower, sometimes only 100 feet above ground, skimming treetops like ghosts. They started flying in trios, 2 as decoys, 1 as the real bomber. The first 2 would draw the enemy's fire, and when the searchlights found them, the third would cut her engine, drift unseen into the target zone, and drop her payload with precision. It was suicide teamwork, and it worked. Every night explosions marked their path. Every morning the Germans found the smoking ruins of their supply depots. Letters from the front between missions, the witches wrote letters home. Most were never delivered. "Mama," one wrote, "we are all tired, but we fly because others can't. The night hides our fear, but sometimes, when I look at the stars, I wish I could see you again." They lived in tents beside the airstrip, ate frozen bread, and patched their own planes with scraps of canvas. Their hands were always black with oil and frostbite, but they still braided each other's hair before missions, a small reminder that they were still human. The price of fire. One night, a young pilot named Olga didn't return from her mission. The next morning, her friends searched the valley. They found the wreckage, a burnt skeleton of wood and metal. Olga had crashed after being hit by flak. Her body was gone. The only thing they found intact was her scarf, tied to a tree branch fluttering in the morning wind. They buried it with her name. That day, the squadron didn't speak much, but that night they all flew again, in Olga's memory. The witch who never fell. In late 1943, Nadezhda Popova was flying a mission when her plane was hit by an enemy night fighter. The engine burst into flames. Her navigator, Katya, yelled, "We're burning!" Nadezhda didn't eject. She turned the burning plane toward the target and dropped the bombs before crash landing in a field. They survived. When she returned to base the next day, her hair was singed, her uniform blackened with smoke. The men on the airfield saluted her. She simply said, "I was not ready to die." Recognition and respect. At first, the male squadrons mocked them. They called them the Sewing Club and Little Sparrows. But after months of watching these young women fly through storms and bullets, the men began to respect them and then admire them. Some of the best Soviet aces said openly, "They fly better than we do." Even the Germans, after intercepting captured radio messages, it admitted their fear. One German general wrote in his diary, "These women, pilots, are not human. They come from the darkness, and they bring death with them." The sky turns red. By 1944, the Night Witches had become legends. Their missions extended deeper into occupied territory, Poland, Belarus, and, finally, the German border. They flew every night without fail, sometimes over snow so bright that their shadows were visible on the ground. They bombed bridges, convoys, factories, and even once a German headquarters. In one 24-hour period, they flew 18 consecutive missions. They slept on the ground, using their parachutes as pillows. Their laughter echoed through the hangars at dawn. For a moment, war seemed small in front of their courage. The last flight. In the spring of 1945, the Night Witches flew their final missions as the Red Army pushed into Germany. Berlin was burning. The war was ending. Their last target was a retreating German column near the Oder River. They took off under a blood-red sky, knowing it might be their final flight. The bombs fell, the engines roared, and then silence. They returned home to a war that was finally over. Out of the original hundreds, only a few dozen remained. Many had fallen, but their legend had already taken flight. Legacy. When peace returned, the Night Witches were forgotten for years. They didn't march in parades or boast of medals. They simply went home, became teachers, mothers, farmers. But whenever they heard the sound of an engine in the night, they remembered the smell of oil, the wind on their faces, and the darkness that once belonged to them. "We were young," Nadezhda Popova once said. "We wanted to live, but we had to fly." By 1943, the Night Witches were no longer a legend. They were an army of ghosts, young women who ruled the darkness. Each mission began the same way. The quiet roar of wooden engines, the cold sting of wind, and a promise whispered to the night. "We'll come back, or we won't." The longest nights, the front had shifted west. The Red Army was gaining ground, but the price was unimaginable. The Night Witches were flying deeper into enemy territory, farther than ever before. Each mission took them beyond familiar terrain, across forests, rivers, and death itself. Their airstrips were mud-soaked and primitive. Sometimes their planes couldn't even take off without being pushed by hand. They worked in silence, fixing engines by lantern light. The smell of oil, fuel, and fear filled the air. At night, they took to the skies again, barely visible against the stars, their shadows dancing over German lines. Each sortie lasted just 20 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. Every minute in the air was a conversation with death. The girl with the compass. Among the regiment's best navigators was Lydia Litviak, a quiet, determined woman who had once dreamed of being a teacher. Now, she guided her pilot through the dark with nothing but a small compass and her memory of the stars. She could sense direction by the rhythm of the wind, judge altitude by the vibration of the wings. Once, her pilot asked her, "How do you always know where we are?" She smiled and said, "The sky tells me." But the sky had its price. On a cold night in October 1943, her plane was hit during a run. They lost altitude fast, but Lydia refused to bail out until they dropped their last bomb. They landed in a field, half the plane torn apart. Both women survived, barely. When she returned to base, her uniform still smoking, the younger pilots stood in awe. To them, she wasn't just a navigator, she was living proof that courage could be quiet. New tactics, new terrors. The Germans were learning. Searchlights now crisscrossed the skies, and new anti-air guns could tear through wood and canvas in seconds. The Night Witches responded with ingenuity. They began flying two-plane diversions, one drawing fire, the other striking the target. It demanded absolute trust. If one made a mistake, both would die. They also started carrying spare fuel cans under their seats to extend their range, knowing a single spark could turn them into living torches. Every improvement came from blood and necessity. One of them wrote in her diary, "We have no fear left, only routine." The sound of wings. The Germans still couldn't understand how such fragile planes could cause so much destruction. Their scouts described the sound before each attack, a faint fluttering, like a giant bird beating its wings in the night. Then, silence. Then, thunder. Every pilot had her ritual. Some kissed the earth before takeoff. Others hummed songs under their breath. For many, it wasn't bravery anymore. It was defiance. They knew the odds. They just didn't care. The firestorm at Novorossiysk. In February 1943, the Night Witches were ordered to support the Soviet offensive at Novorossiysk, a port city turned fortress by the Germans. The mission required flying through constant shell fire, often less than 300 feet above the ground. They launched wave after wave, dropping bombs on warehouses, artillery, and tanks. Tracer rounds lit up the sky like fireworks, and explosions reflected on the sea below. For 6 straight nights, they attacked without rest. They flew through storms, landed on shredded runways, and went up again. When the city finally fell, Soviet generals called them the invisible hand of victory. But the women knew the truth. Victory was built on the bones of their friends. Letters never sent. War doesn't pause for grief. The Night Witches learned to bury pain in silence. They would gather around a campfire, holding small pieces of paper, letters written by those who would never return. They read them aloud one last time, then burned them, watching the ashes float into the black sky. "Maybe," one said softly, "they'll reach them up there." Each death hardened them, but never erased their tenderness. They still brushed snow off each other's jackets, shared the last piece of bread, and fixed each other's braids before takeoff. Even in hell, they refused to forget they were women, an enemy's respect. Captured German soldiers spoke of them in whispers. They claimed the witches flew without fear, that even when their planes caught fire, they aimed their crashes toward German camps. One terrified officer confessed, "They appear when there's no moon. You can't see them, you can only feel the air move before they strike." That fear spread faster than propaganda. By the end of 1943, German troops near the southern front refused to light cigarettes outdoors, afraid the tiny spark would attract a witch's bomb. The medal that never came. Despite their heroism, the Night Witches faced discrimination from within their own army. They were denied proper supplies, rarely given medals, and sometimes replaced by male pilots in official records. Commanders said, "They're too young, too emotional, too fragile." But every night those fragile women proved them wrong. They flew up to 10 sorties a night, through freezing winds and flak storms, often landing with frostbitten fingers and bullet holes through their planes. Their only reward was survival. The winter of iron as winter set in. The nights grew longer and deadlier. The cold turned their engines to ice, their fuel thick as honey. They kept bottles of vodka beside their cockpits, not to drink, but to pour over frozen carburetors. Their laughter echoed through the dark airfields. Half crazy, half unbreakable, they were exhausted, hungry, and covered in grime. But when the order came, they always said the same words: "Let's go. The sky remembers." By early 1944, the Night Witches had become a myth. Their faces were printed in Soviet newspapers. But their real stories, the fear, the grief, the love, remained hidden in the smoke of war. Many of them had lost everything. Yet when they looked up, they still called the sky home. "It's the only place," one pilot said, "where we are free." In the darkness of 1944, the witches burned brighter than ever. They had no armor, no mercy, no fear, only wings, fire, and each other. They weren't fighting for medals. They were fighting for the right to exist, and for the silence of the night to carry their names forever. The war was reaching its final act. The Red Army was pushing west, chasing the retreating German forces across Poland and into the heart of Europe. But for the Night Witches, the young Soviet women who had ruled the skies for years, this was not victory yet. This was vengeance. The nights were shorter now, but the fire burned brighter than ever. The road to Poland. By the spring of 1944, the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment, once a small group of untested girls, had become a machine of precision and defiance. They flew older planes patched with canvas and tape, each marked by bullet holes and burn scars from years of war. The new mission: cross the Dniester River and strike deep into Nazi-occupied Poland. It was a suicide assignment, but none of them hesitated. Before takeoff, their commander, Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, gathered the pilots under the pale moonlight. She said only one thing: "Fly low, hit hard, don't let them rest." That night, the witches took off in silence, their wooden wings gliding over forests and rivers. Below them, the Germans were retreating, but the women saw no mercy in the darkness. Every flash of light, every explosion on the horizon, felt like justice long delayed, the price of revenge. The missions became relentless. 10, 12 sorties per night, no rest, no heat, no pause between the sound of bombs and engines, their hands blistered on frozen controls, their eyes bloodshot from smoke and exhaustion. They flew until they forgot their own names. One pilot, Tatiana Makarova, was hit during a bombing run. Her plane burst into flames mid-air. Instead of bailing out, she aimed the burning biplane toward a German convoy below, a final act of defiance. The explosion lit up the valley like dawn. When her comrades saw the fireball from miles away, they whispered through tears. She didn't fall. She struck. Tatiana was gone. But her story spread like wildfire through the regiment. The sky over Poland. The landscape below was unrecognizable. Fields of snow turned to ash, villages erased by retreating German forces. The Night Witches flew through smoke so thick it felt like the air itself was burning. They struck bridges, artillery positions, and command posts. Every mission weakened the enemy lines, but the Germans adapted. Searchlights now filled the sky like prison bars, and radar-guided flak followed them with deadly precision. Still, the women didn't break formation. They flew through the beams, bombs dropping in perfect silence before they vanished back into darkness. They fly like spirits, one captured German officer told interrogators. You cannot kill what you cannot see. The unseen war. The world was beginning to celebrate victories. Normandy, Stalingrad, the liberation of Paris. But on the Eastern Front, the witches were fighting a different war. one measured not in parades, but in survival. Every night was a gamble between life and death. When they landed at dawn, their faces were covered in soot and frost, their hands trembling from fatigue, and yet they smiled, because each morning they returned alive meant one more victory the world would never see. Between missions, their base had moved again, this time to a bombed-out field near Lublin, Poland. There were no proper barracks, no hangars, no lights. They lived in tents beside the airstrip, melting snow in helmets to wash, patching uniforms with pieces of old parachutes. In rare, quiet moments, they told stories about home, about their first flights, about the friends who never came back. One pilot kept a notebook filled with names of the fallen. She added to it after every raid. When asked why, she said, "Someone has to remember them." They laughed when they could, cried when no one was looking, and flew when the night called. The return of the firestorm. By late 1944, the Night Witches were ordered to support the Red Army's final push toward Germany. Their targets grew larger: railroads, factories, and heavy supply columns. The missions were dangerous beyond imagination. They flew over newly liberated cities still crawling with snipers and hidden anti-air guns, but they didn't hesitate. Their small biplanes, invisible to radar, slipped through enemy defenses like ghosts. Each bomb drop echoed like thunder across the plains of Europe. The German front lines began to crumble. One night, the Witches hit a massive ammunition depot near the Oder River. The explosion was so powerful that it shattered windows 20 kilometers away. When the smoke cleared, the entire valley glowed red. The Germans said afterward, "Hell came from the sky that night." A flight through fire. In February 1945, one of the most harrowing missions took place. Two planes, one led by Irina Sabrova and her navigator Lydia Svistunova, were caught in a storm of flak fire near the front. Their wings were shredded, and one engine burst into flames. Instead of turning back, Irina pushed forward. Her co-pilot screamed over the wind, but Irina's voice was calm. "We finished the job." They reached the target, dropped their bombs, and then crash-landed in no man's land. Both survived, wounded, but alive. When they were found by Soviet infantry at dawn, their uniforms were soaked in blood and oil. Irina simply said, "Target destroyed." Her calm became legend. The regiment began calling her the Iron Witch. Recognition, finally. By the spring of 1945, the war was nearly over. The Night Witches had completed over 30,000 combat missions. They had dropped more than 23,000 tons of bombs. They were now the most decorated all-female unit in Soviet history. But medals could never measure what they endured. The cold, the loss, the endless nights. Many of them had aged a decade in just 3 years. Their hair had turned gray, their hands were scarred with burns and blisters. Yet when they lined up for inspection, their eyes still burned with the same light as the day they first flew. The last march. In April 1945, the Night Witches were assigned one final mission: support the Soviet advance into Germany. The target: a German supply column retreating from Berlin. They took off before dawn. The air filled with fog and gunfire. It was one of their longest flights yet. By the time they reached the target, the fuel gauges were nearly empty. They dropped the last of their bombs and turned home. As they crossed the border, the horizon glowed orange. Berlin was burning. For the first time in years, they saw the end of the war. No one spoke. They just flew, in silence, toward the light of dawn. The Witches' triumph. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the Night Witches didn't celebrate. They sat quietly beside their planes, their faces illuminated by sunrise. For them, victory was not joy. It was survival. Out of the hundreds who had once flown, only a handful remained. The rest had vanished into the night they once commanded, but their legacy was written in the sky, and in the fear that haunted the German soldiers to their graves. We were not witches. one of them later said, "We were just girls who refused to stop flying." They came with no armor, no radar, no glory. Only faith, fire, and flight. The Nazis called them witches. History calls them heroes. The night belonged to them and forever will. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the world cheered. Cities filled with parades, bells, and the songs of peace. But far from the noise, on a quiet airfield on the western edge of Poland, a group of women stood beside their battered planes. They didn't cheer. They simply looked at the sunrise, the first they had seen in years without the smell of smoke. The last flight, their final mission had ended just days before. Berlin was in ruins. The Reich had fallen, and the women who had haunted the German army for 3 long years were told to stand down. The 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment, once the 588th, was officially decommissioned. No music, no ceremony. Just a short order and the quiet sound of engines cooling in the morning air. They gathered one last time beside their planes. Some hugged, some cried, some just stood in silence. The wooden wings that had carried them through thousands of nights now rested still, like exhausted soldiers. For a moment, they all looked up at the sky, the only home they had ever truly known. And then, one by one, they walked away. The forgotten heroes. When the war ended, the Night Witches expected to be remembered, to be honored as the heroes they were. But history had other plans. In the chaos of reconstruction, the Soviet Union turned its attention to rebuilding the nation and rewriting its own story. Women were told to return to their traditional roles. The army replaced them with men. Their stories, their victories, were buried beneath propaganda and silence. Even the newspapers that once celebrated them stopped printing their names. One pilot wrote years later, "We fought the enemy with fire, and then we fought the world with silence. Life after the sky." Most of them went home, if they still had a home to go to. Nadezhda Popova, the fearless pilot who once flew 852 missions, became a flight instructor. Her students never knew the stories behind her calm eyes. Commander Yevdokia Bershanskaya retired quietly, living out her years in a small village far from the airfields where her voice once commanded the night. Irina Sebrova, the Iron Witch, worked in civil aviation, but she never spoke about the war again. Some married soldiers. Others lived alone. A few disappeared completely, their names lost to time. The weight of memory. The memories of the war stayed with them, not as glory, but as ghosts. They woke at night to the sound of engines that no longer existed. They smelled smoke where there was none. They dreamed of endless skies and the faces of those who never came back. One veteran said in an interview decades later, "When I close my eyes, I still see the night, and I still hear the wind on the wings." They were proud, but they carried their pride quietly. The medals they earned were kept in drawers. Their stories were told only to family, in whispers over tea. Because for years, no one asked, and few wanted to listen. Rediscovery. Then, slowly, the silence began to break. In the 1960s and 70s, historians stumbled upon the names of the forgotten women aviators of World War II. Photographs were found. Young faces in flight helmets, smiling against the wind. Records showed thousands of missions, hundreds of confirmed hits, and a unit so effective that the Germans once offered a bounty for capturing a single pilot alive. The world began to remember. Documentaries were made. Books were written. Old medals were polished and pinned again, this time with tears instead of pride. When Nadezhda Popova was asked what she felt hearing people finally speak her name after 40 years, she smiled and said, "We were never gone. The sky remembered us." Letters from the past. Some of their diaries were found long after they had passed. In one tattered notebook, a line read, "If we die, tell them we were not afraid. Tell them we loved the sky." Another, written by a navigator just before a mission, said, "If the night takes me, I'll become part of the wind." These weren't just words, they were echoes, proof that even in darkness they had found something eternal. The legacy lives on. Today, their story is taught in flight academies and military schools across the world. There are monuments in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, and near the ruins of their old airfields. Pilots, men and women, still visit those places to leave flowers, and sometimes small wooden propellers carved by hand. Their nickname, Night Witches, once meant fear. Now it means courage. In modern Russia, when a woman pilot completes her first solo night flight, instructors often tell her, "You've joined the witches," and she smiles, because she knows what that means. The sky never forgets. The last surviving night witch, when asked what she missed most about those days, didn't talk about medals or glory. She looked out the window at a pale evening sky and said softly, "The night. It was ours." Then she laughed, a quiet, tired laugh, the kind only someone who has seen too much can give. We weren't supposed to win, but we did. They rose from the ashes of war, flew on wings of wood and faith, and carved their names into the silence of history. The world forgot them once, but the sky never did. And tonight, when the wind whispers through the darkness, somewhere out there the witches still fly,